Welcome to Italy Beyond the Guidebook with me, Deborah Cater of Italy News Online, and my sister, Sarah Cater of Floeasy, a licensed tour guide based in Florence, Italy. In this episode, we travel to the heart of Umbria to mark the 800th anniversary of the death of St Francis of Assisi, Italy's most beloved spiritual figure. Born in Assisi, Francis lived a life that challenged the wealth and politics of medieval society, choosing instead a path of simplicity, compassion, and devotion to nature. Today, his message still shapes both spiritual life and cultural identity across Italy and far beyond. We'll explore the story of Francis's life and teachings, and what Assisi would have been like in medieval times and how best to enjoy it now. From history and spirituality to modern-day travel experiences, we'll look at why Francis's legacy continues to resonate 8 centuries after his death. So join us as we go beyond the guidebook and step into the living history of St Francis of Assisi.
St Francis, the patron saint of Italy, founder of the Franciscan order and the world's most beloved saint. But what do we know of St Francis? Well, quite a bit as it happens. He wrote letters, prayers, poems, and the 2 rules for his religious order. There are also biographies that were written at the time. One by a contemporary and disciple of St Francis called Thomas Celano. He wrote a book entitled Vita Prima, a work on the saint's life. We discover through him that St Francis was the eldest son of one of the richest men of Assisi, a wealthy cloth merchant, named John originally by his mother, which was then changed to Francis by his father. He was baptized in the 12th century cathedral, San Rufino in Assisi, and that his story was a riches to rags tale, as St Francis was neither poor nor saintly in his youth, and he led a very privileged life. Celano writes, from the earliest years of his life, his parents reared him to arrogance, in accordance with the vanity of the age. And by long imitating their worthless life and character, he himself was made vain and arrogant. Until the age of 25, St Francis wasted and squandered his time miserably in pursuit of practical jokes, idle gossip. He was easygoing and affable, but rich and arrogant. Francis, he grew up in warlike times, and he fought against Perugia, being taken and held prisoner for a year. He becomes gravely ill. After his recovery, he continues his life as before, though. He continues to pursue the enjoyment, festivities. He'll continue life as a soldier, which in 12th century Italy was the ideal, this ideal of knights and a life of chivalry.
Okay, so what took him from man about town dressed in swanky clothes to a bloke clothed in a brown robe with a knotted belt?
He'll become gravely ill again, seriously ill, this time with a fever. And it's during this period that he then actually starts to reevaluate and reflect on his life and start to change. He goes on a pilgrimage to Rome, and he believed that to understand poverty, he himself must do the begging. He returns to Assisi very troubled, and he's calling to God for guidance. And this is where we come to the very famous episode of St. Francis praying within the church of San Damiano. And it's in this church that he hears a voice coming from the crucifix, the cross. And this voice asks Francis to go and repair my house, which as thou seest is falling utterly into ruin. Now Francis will take this to mean the church in which he was praying. And so he'll gather all the cloth to sell, so from his father's shop. He'll sell all the goods. And then you can imagine his father's enraged, is so displeased by this that it actually imprisoned St. Francis. And St. Francis will only be released by his mother. And at this point, Francis said, okay, I abandon this world. So he withdraws from family and friends. He'll live in hermit caves and he'll build up ruined churches. He was called Il Poverello, the little poor one. He devoted himself to a life of poverty and simplicity. He followed the teachings of Christ and followed in his footsteps. Now, Francis will also change from the church builder and a hermit to become an apostle and evangelist. He'll begin to preach and he finds his first disciples.
So these first disciples and Francis, they don't just stick within Assisi, do they? They do spread far and wide and to spread the word.
Oh, yeah. He sent his friars 2 by 2 on missionary trips, so throughout the world, proclaiming peace to mankind and repentance, although as we discover not all was plain sailing when in 1220 news arrives of the death of the first 5 Franciscan martyrs in Morocco. Our St Francis said to a new disciple, "Long enough hast thou borne the belt, the sword, and the spurs. The time has now come for you to change the belt for a rope, the sword for the cross of Jesus Christ, the spurs for the dust and dirt of the road. Follow me, and I will make you a knight in the army of Christ." The Franciscans promoted their rule of poverty, charity, and obedience. This is the reason for the 3 knots on their belt. This pilgrimage was interpreted as this model for the perfect Christian life itself, a journey travelled in prayer. And St. Francis believed that although he and his friars lived in poverty, it was to everyone's conscience to decide how they lived. He was never critical of the church. So this is very important. In fact, the only criticism he understood was self-criticism. He was not a reformer of the church. He promised obedience to the Pope. And this is why when he seeks permission from Pope Innocent III to found this new religious order, the official founding of the Franciscan order, the rules of the order were granted along with papal permission to preach.
Okay. Well, you see, if you don't fight against the powers that be, you get what you want, don't you? So they travelled across Europe. They went to the Middle East, preaching away, but they didn't neglect Italy either. And they ended up just down the road, really, in Florence, where they founded the best, to my mind, best basilica there is in the city.
Yeah, the first followers of St. Francis arrived in Florence in the early 1200s, followed later by St. Francis himself. Although dates can differ, the general consensus is that the Franciscans founded their church of Santa Croce in 1221 and have occupied it ever since. The Santa Croce Church is fantastic. It's the largest Franciscan church in the world, and today really is the pantheon of Florence. It's where all the great and good are buried, including Michelangelo, Galileo Galilei. There are more than 4,000 works within this monumental complex. Lots of art in there, and art of the Franciscans, there is a real connection because the teachings of the Franciscans referred to God as human. He'd taken flesh. He'd walked amongst us, lived within a family. And this innovation of Christianity therefore led to the innovation of art. So we have artists such as Cimabue, Giotto, responding to these new ideas. And Christ was painted with more realism and emotion. And this supplanted the Byzantine style that had focused more on the heaven and the spiritual, which was visually unknown to us. So St. Francis, through his preachings, had contributed actually to the development and change in art during the 13th and the 14th centuries.
Yeah, great. That's great. But I'm going to hazard a guess that most people, if you mention St. Francis of Assisi, are going to say nature, not art. That's what they would associate him with. And that was a major part of his teaching, wasn't it? You know, we always see him depicted with animals, particularly with birds. And there are stories and legends about him with animals. But he also had some traditional miracles attributed to him as well, didn't he?
Yeah, many miracles were attributed to St Francis. Lepers were cleansed, the blind received their sight, the crippled began to walk. And you're right, a lot of the stories surround his life are connected to his love for animals. He'd encouraged his followers to venerate nature as God's blessed creation. You've got the very famous story, St Francis and the Wolf of Gubbio. You often see St Francis depicted with birds, which symbolize the spread of the Franciscan order throughout the world. Legend has it that St Francis on his deathbed thanked his donkey for carrying and helping him throughout his life, and his donkey wept.
Poor little donk. But he was quite young, not the donkey, St Francis, when he died, wasn't he?
Yeah. And nearing the end of his life, he received the stigmata, making him the first person to bear the 5 wounds of Christ. You have the miracle of the stigmata, which is described in another follower of St Francis, St Bonaventura, and he writes the life of St Francis. St Francis dies 2 years after receiving the stigmata on the 3rd of October 1226 within the Cappella del Transito, which is now located within the Basilica di Santa Maria degli Angeli, which is 4 kilometres from Assisi, which becomes his final resting place.
Okay. They didn't waste any time in canonising him either, did they?
Was that St Francis or the donkey?
I don't know.
Or St
The
Francis?
holy donkey of St Francis. I don't know. Continue.
St Francis, yes, was canonised 2 years after his death. Then, a day later, they start the construction of the basilica. Very short period for its construction, rare for a church of its size, and this is often explained away as a measure of the great love that the people had for St Francis, and today he lies in the crypt. As there's a huge basilica, there's an upper and lower church with frescoes that cover the walls, and it's these artists, Cimabue, Giotto, their assistants, that depicted the life of St Francis in a very famous set of, or cycle of frescoes. By the mid-1400s, pilgrims are flocking to Assisi from all parts of Europe, and today the basilica is among the most visited of Christian shrines. However, not always this pretty pilgrimage town.
No, not at all. In medieval times, Assisi was a very different place from what we experience today. During the 12th and 13th centuries, it was essentially a walled hilltop settlement. And there were conflicts between power, faith, local nobles, and of course the wider political struggle between the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire. Medieval Assisi was a town of contrasts. So on one hand, it was prosperous. We had trade routes passing through Umbria. They bring in wealth from agriculture, textiles, local crafts, and the merchants and artisans formed an important middle class. And this is where St. Francis was born into. And wealth was displayed through stone houses and defensive towers built by the competing families. They are very keen on a tower. And these towers were not just homes, they were symbols of power and protection during times of civil conflict. Now, that was the prosperous side. However, life was harsh for many of the residents. Disease was common, sanitation was poor, social inequality was visible. The wealthy lived comfortably inside their little fortified buildings and towers, while the poorer workers lived in more modest homes amongst their workshops, their forges, their little factories, in the lower streets of the town. Even before Francis became a saint, religion played a central role in daily life for both rich and poor, offering comfort and social structure to their world. The town itself would have been very noisy and very crowded, particularly down in the lower levels. The church bells would have been ringing, the market traders would have been shouting about their wares, you'd have had the blacksmith hammering, you'd have had the noise of people creating the textiles, the animals, and so on. And their narrow streets, noise travel venturi effect. It's going to get noisy, very noisy down there. So it was a living medieval community that had commerce, faith, and politics. Now, Francis of Assisi, he didn't just form the Franciscan order, he also had a massive influence on a girl, the local girl from Assisi, called Clare, who formed her own following, known as the Poor Clares.
Yep, you're right. St Clare, as St Francis, born in Assisi to a noble family. As a young girl, she's very different, she's very pious, gave to the poor, and then she'll refuse to marry, citing that she's consecrated herself to God and wants nothing of a man. Clare heard the preachings of St Francis from the pulpit of San Rufino and St George's Church, and he became her spiritual guide. It's on Palm Sunday that she will make her way to his little chapel, and she'll exchange her fanciful dress for a rough woolen robe, her jewelled belt for a rope, and her hair was cut off by St Francis to be replaced with a black veil.
Oh, wow. Completely shaved off or just hacked at?
Hacked at. If anyone's watched Game of Thrones and where they cut Cersei's hair off, it would have been like that. Just
okay.
chopped. Yeah, randomly. Yeah. Clare is also a bit like St Francis in the fact that she'll write a rule of order, and this rule of order was divided into 12 chapters. The sisters was also lived by obedience, poverty, chastity. They wore no shoes, ate no meat. They lived in a poor house and kept silent most of the time. Their life consisted of manual labour and prayer. The St Clare's, they don't go out to preach as the Franciscans did.
Yeah.
And Clare will live until she's about 60 years old. She'd spent 41 years in a convent. And she'll be canonised St Clare of Assisi in 1255. There will also be the construction of her basilica, which is completed in 1260, and her remains are beneath the main altar. Now, you can imagine this is a girl or a woman that's eating no meat, it's got no shoes. You can imagine the cold floor. You can imagine that she was often ill because of this. And strange but true, she'll be designated as the patron saint of television on the basis that when she was too ill to attend Mass, she nevertheless had been able to see and hear it on the wall of her room.
Okay. All right. Well, these popes will clutch at any straw, won't they? Okay, patron saint of television. So what's Assisi like today? Because we've got St Clare's and St Francis's basilicas and their remains, and it's a pilgrimage town now.
It is. When I used to take groups to Assisi, we used to arrive by coach, and we actually used to visit the Basilica of Santa Maria degli Angeli first. It's the 8th largest church in the world. It's also a pilgrimage site because it was built when Pope Pius V wanted to contain the oratory, the chapel, the rose garden, everything that was sacred to the memory of St Francis. This was the chapel that had been restored by St Francis himself. It was here that he'd come to understand that his vocation clearly, where the friars would gather, their enthusiasm renewed before they went out to continue their mission. It was within this chapel, immersed in prayer. St Francis saw above the high altar Christ and the Madonna, surrounded by a multitude of angels. Within the church, well, the basilica, is the lock of hair from St Clare, cut by St Francis. You also find the cord of St Francis, and it was in the infirmary, now called the Cappella del Transito, which is where St Francis actually died. So when you go in, it's this huge basilica, and then you have this little chapel enclosed. And so this is where you can go and see where he died. To the right of the chapel, there's a little doorway which will then take you to see, which is behind glass, the little rose garden. And this rose garden contains the roses that is said that St Francis threw himself upon whilst wrestling with temptation, only to find that the roses lost their thorns on contact with his body. So we used to go there first, and then we used to go back to the coach, and then we used to drive the 4 kilometres to Assisi. And Assisi, this hilltop town, and you have this upper and lower. It's almost on this slope, the city itself. That I used to take the coach to the upper car park. So if you're looking at the city, to go up to the right hand side, because it's there that you had the stair lift that would take you right to the top, and then you'd walk along and you get these fantastic views over the countryside. Then you'd arrive at the Basilica of St Clare, which you could enter if you wish, and then you'd continue on to a little piazza where you can get your coffees, or you find lots of souvenirs there. You could also go up to the cathedral, San Rufino, where St Francis, St Clare were baptized, where she's heard his preachings. There's also a temple of St Minerva there. So very, very sweet. And then you can decide on which direction you wish to head down towards the basilica dedicated to St Francis. If you've walked down, then you're going to arrive first in the upper basilica, and then you can go down to the lower basilica, and then continue down. You've got the crypt, and then from the lower basilica you then exit, and then you follow the path round, and then you come down to the lower coach park, where you'll find again, a few souvenir places. You'll find, somewhere you can have the local delicacy of Umbria. You can have your porchettas, your pork sandwiches.
Love
But
a
it's definitely
porchetta.
a city worth going to. But you do wonder when you go into the basilica, is this what St Francis intended, this man of poverty and simplicity?
Probably not, hey? So, I mean, I can't understand why anyone would want to walk. That's a heck of a walk up. So I'd always go to the top car park. I don't know why anyone would want to stay down at the bottom car park.
No.
No. And
You'd definitely need some holy water if you'd be walking from the lower car park up to the basilica. Or definitely if you were going to walk up right to the top.
Need something a lot stronger than holy water, I can tell you. My goodness. And I'm just wondering about these roses. How thorny are they? I mean,
they're no longer thorny.
They're not
They've
these
lost
roses
all their
without
thorns.
thorns, are they? That he's like, gone, I'll throw myself at this. It's like an easy way out there, Francis. I mean, you could have chosen something a little rougher. Oh, these saints. Anyway, thank you very much. It was very enlightening. So now we know a bit more about Francis and the town of Assisi. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like and subscribe, share with friends and family. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode and any suggestions you may have for Season 2 subjects. You'll find more cultural stories and context at italynews.online and at Floeasy.online, which is Sarah's website, where you can also book tours for Florence with your specialist guide. And next time on Italy Beyond the Guidebook, we'll be exploring the Medicis. Dun, 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 because they do need a little sort of like dramatic theme tune, I think. They're a powerful Florentine family who used art as a form of propaganda and left us with some incredible masterpieces as a result. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye!
Bye!